So hi everyone, today we have with us Mr. Joe Phelan, who's the director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in India. He's responsible for growing international recognition for sustainable Indian business approaches and for scaling up joint action by business in support of India's development. He currently oversees programs engaging more than 100 companies in action in India in areas such as clean energy, water, and more resilient agriculture. A little bit about WBCSD. It's the premier global CEO-led community of over 200 of the world's leading sustainable businesses, working collectively to accelerate the system transformations needed for a net zero future. So WBCSD engages executives and sustainable leaders from businesses and elsewhere to share practical insights on obstacles and opportunities that we currently face in tackling the integrated climate, nature, and inequality sustainability challenge. So thank you so much for being with us here today, Mr. Phelan. So.
Great, Avni, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm very happy to be doing this.
Okay, great. So my first question for you is, WBCSD is a CEO-led organization, and you work closely with business leaders in your mission of achieving a sustainable, equitable future. And but at the same time, the zeitgeist of sustainable development in the 21st century has been towards engaging communities through a bottom-up approach. And so how is WBCSD's work particularly effective and necessary in this context? And how does it complement a lot of the community-oriented work that's happening right now?
Thank you. Thank you. So it's a really important question because if we're looking, let's just start with climate change. It's important that communities get access to energy and that energy is clean and that they protect the environment in which they operate and that they have sustainable livelihoods. And as individuals, it's important the decisions we make as consumers, but the impact that we can have and that individuals can have and communities can have is very, very small in comparison to the impact of the very large companies. So companies that are in sectors producing power or producing materials for construction, for example, or aviation, or even rice production, have very, very large shares of the total greenhouse gas emissions globally. And so by working with the very big companies in these sectors, we can have a very big impact in changing course and reducing global warming and protecting the environment.
Thank you. So my second question for you is, what are some of the major hurdles that businesses face in developing countries, and particularly in India, in moving towards net zero carbon emissions? And what role can citizens play as consumers in demanding more sustainable and equitable business practices?
Right. Well, the hurdles for achieving net zero for a company in a developing economy or in or specifically in India, first of all, it depends a lot on what sector a company is in. And some companies have made a lot of progress towards net zero and should achieve net zero soon because their energy consumption is all electrical and it's all at certain times of day, and so they're able to link that directly to renewable power, and then along with energy efficiency and some offsets, becoming net zero is very achievable. It's much more challenging for sectors that rely on 24/7 energy and also high volumes of energy, where they'll be relying a lot because the power mix in India is heavily reliant on coal. And many companies will have their own coal-fired power stations as part of their energy production. So that is an immediate challenge for businesses that are in energy-intensive sectors with need for 24/7 firm power. Also, some industries have emissions as part of their processes. So just in the creation of cement or steel, for example, emissions come about, or I mentioned rice, producing methane from rice production, for example. So there it's much more challenging. So one, more challenging for sectors, but particularly in India, first because of the prevalence of coal in the energy mix. Second, because some of the newer technologies, cleaner technologies, require an ecosystem that isn't yet here in India. So, for example, the availability of lots of scrap steel is necessary for electric arc furnace technologies, or the distribution system for clean hydrogen products is not yet there, as well as a gap currently in the production of clean hydrogen. So there are challenges there. And then I think thirdly, and this goes into your question about what can citizens do. Thirdly, there are still gaps in the policy environment for businesses in India. And this is because India is still developing very fast. So whereas in Europe or North America, the countries are largely developed, and so policies are directed towards cleaning up the power system, cleaning up industry. Here, the economies are growing. A large proportion of the population are still just getting access to energy, or the energy they have is unreliable. Their consumption is increasing as their incomes increase, as they enter the middle class. And so the policy environment here is designed to support the realization of people's aspirations in providing food and shelter and other needs to themselves and their families, rather than having grown trying to decarbonize. So it's a different environment. And so when you ask what citizens can do, I think the biggest thing that they can do is find out where their energy comes from, find out who their member of parliament is, their MLA is, and what their position is on climate-related policies. So how do they vote on aspects around a coal cess or renewable purchase obligations? So as citizens, we can certainly make informed decisions as consumers of energy and other products, but also we really need to understand who our representatives are and what decisions they're making, and and get involved and make clear what you want to see happen. Educate yourself and engage constructively in the democratic processes which are there in this country, and which are there to support all of us.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think how you spoke about developing countries not being able to orient their policies in the same way as developed countries, because a large part of their population is still coming out of poverty. I think, which is why a lot of politicians or a lot of legislators don't have climate change as their top priority. And so I think in that context, it becomes harder to engage sometimes citizens.
Yeah.
So my next.
That's right. And just to be clear, I think that this government understands well that the population in India is very much at risk, very vulnerable to climate change, but it has to do a balancing act, and it knows very well the risks that are there, but that balancing act is very difficult. And I'd also just like to add, forgive me, as well as finding out where your energy comes from, how it's produced, finding out if you can get onto greener tariffs. Also, what's very important is finding out how your food is produced, because the food that we eat has a big impact on the environment and also on livelihoods, and understanding the impact, for example, of millets versus wheat, or where your rice is grown and under what conditions, or where the sugar's coming from. All of these things will, one, in a small way, they'll ensure that you're making healthy, sustainable choices. But two, the more knowledge you have, the more that you're able to influence the overall system.
And I think certain communities have access to very different resources compared to other communities, and they tend to lead more carbon intensive lifestyles. So if you do have the choice to eat indigenous food or locally grown produce instead of importing food, I think that's a choice that if you are able to make it, we have to consciously choose to shift in that direction. So my next question for you is, recently India committed to what some critics have labeled as ambitious targets at the COP26 conference. And some of these include installing non-fossil fuel electricity by 2030 and sourcing 50% of energy requirement from renewables by 2030, achieving carbon intensity reduction of 45% over 2005 levels by 2030, and achieving net zero by 2070. So first off, how achievable do you think that these targets are? Do you think that they are ambitious, or do you think we could do even better than this? And is the current pace of change within businesses sufficient to achieve these targets?
Sure. So thank you. So of course, the ambition set in the statements is linked to the pace of change within business. So now that there is a net zero target for India, it's 2070, which is further out than most other countries, but it's there. So that's a very strong signal to business of what the direction is. The 2030 targets are very ambitious and are relatively short term. So, that's 8 years, or 9 years for the end of 2030, which is very short term. And so, is current ambition and action at that level? No, but the signal from government will help to accelerate action. And in terms of, are they achievable and the level of ambition that's required? So they are achievable, but just on the renewable target. So India's more or less almost met its renewable target set in Paris with the addition of renewable energy capacity. But the new target requires a quadrupling of capacity addition each year compared to what we've had in the last 5 years or what the current rate is. So we've had an acceleration of renewable energy deployment, but we need to see that now quadruple. So they are achievable, but they do require a lot of ambition and a lot of action. But the signals coming from government, are clearer than ever. So and that's what organizations like mine are working to support that kind of action.
And you spoke about how 2070 is quite long term. So how do you think that, since leadership and generally companies tend to have leadership changes faster than this target is really long term. So how do you think that we can plan for the long term, or businesses can plan for say 48 years out from now?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But the 2030 targets, that's why they're so important, because they do require attention and action now. And sorry, you asked about, should India commit to more? So there is a ratchet mechanism in the international climate process, and the expectation is that countries will go back with enhanced targets, and there's going to be another Congress of the Parties at the end of 2022 taking place in Cairo, Egypt. And the expectation is that more targets will come. At WBCSD, we would really like to see a target for India on electrification of vehicles. We think that, especially in two-wheelers, that can be done very quickly. But across all vehicle types, we think that 100% EVs is possible, and we think that 70%, 65-70% certainly is possible of new sales by 2030, and that's a target we'd like to see. So there will be a ratchet, and a 2070 target is kind of out of scope for most of us, but we can see the direction, and the short-term steps are very clear.
So my next question for you is, in the context of India's recent commitments, do you think that developed countries are doing enough to cover their historic contribution to emissions, and the fact that citizens in developed countries tend to have a higher per capita carbon intensiveness? How do you think that this can be dealt with on a global scale?
Yeah. Well, no. No, I don't. I think that there will be more on north to south financing, especially on the adaptation side. That is scaling up quicker actually than the mitigation side. And I think that people talk about climate justice and a just transition, and without that, I don't think it is climate justice. But whilst the developed world has not delivered on the commitments it has made, and it must deliver on the commitments it has made in terms of climate finance, I don't think that the developed world will ever compensate for all of its historical emissions. And unfortunately, in India, we're very vulnerable to climate change. So whilst pushing for compensation and redressal, and maybe that's sort of setting up, a kind of adversarial approach, and really what India needs is partners to help it transition and partners to help it build resilience, which is really important for all of us, rather than, compensation is kind of a bit. So India certainly should push for that, but nevertheless, action needs to continue here, because India stands to lose as much or more than anyone in terms of climate change. So, and again, I think that the government understands that.
So following up on that, how accurate or relevant do you think that talking about climate commitments in terms of countries is anymore? And so, for instance, I read in The Guardian recently that 90% of the emissions attributed to the top 20 climate culprits was, 20 companies are responsible for about 30% of carbon emissions, and 90% of these emissions are attributed to the use of their products, such as petrol, jet fuel, natural gas, thermal coal, and a portion of that came from extracting, refining, and delivering the finished fuels. And so, is setting targets for countries enough, or do we need to rethink our approach? And since not all of these energy providing businesses are state-owned, some of them are private businesses, right? So.
Yeah. So, of course, it has to be both. So each country puts forward its nationally determined contributions, and that would include that would cover all the emissions from that country's economy. So whether it's publicly owned, state-owned, privately owned, makes no difference. And that's right, and that's how jurisdictions set laws. And so it's right that happens. But absolutely, all businesses play a role, and some play a really important role, as you've identified, and that's why my organization exists. And something that we talked about at WBCSD at the COP last month in Glasgow was, alongside nationally determined contributions, we should have corporate determined contributions, where companies make clear their commitments, and to bring transparency into that process and remove any form of greenwashing. So we agree with you, and that's your idea, and we've had that idea too. So we think that's important. Another thing that's really important and came out in the way you described it is that the mechanism that we have for measuring emissions covers scope 1, 2, and 3, and scope 3 is how products are used. And in some ways, it's a clever way of moving the attention away from a few of those big companies into all of us when we travel in our cars or sit in our homes or whatever it is, or use our computers. And those emissions, the use of products, are called scope 3 emissions. And so what's really important is getting really good transparency on scope 3 emissions, so that when we have transparency, then we can understand the size of the challenge and where action needs to be taken, and how we can hold people to account, and how we can reduce emissions and limit global warming. So this sort of carbon transparency piece is really important in the scope 3 area, and that's something that leading companies are working really hard on to bring greater clarity to through the Carbon Transparency Initiative. So if you're interested in that, look that up.
No, and I think I agree with you completely on how important it is for companies to be more transparent, because a lot of times you see that there's a shifting of responsibility to consumers, and a large proportion of consumers don't have that choice. A lot, like for example, in developed countries, like we spoke about before, like the renewable energy or renewable sources are not as accessible or affordable for a large proportion of the population. And so I think it's important to shift the focus back, especially in a lot of cases, to the companies that are responsible for these emissions and for creating these products, and to kind of make them less carbon intensive or more sustainable right from start to finish, instead of shifting the blame at different instances.
Let me just say I completely agree. So yes, we as citizens, we should educate ourselves and we should make informed choices, and partly we should do that, one, so that we're minimizing our footprint, but also so that we understand that in India, our office when we first started here had a bigger carbon footprint with 4 staff than our office in Geneva with at the time 60 staff, because there the climate was different and it was heated through heat transfer linked to the lake, whereas ours came from an electricity contract with a coal-powered energy in a very inefficient building. Now we were able to then move to a more efficient building, which has helped with more daylight, which has helped as consumers, but we still can't influence how the power is generated. So understand what we can control, but also understand that the change that needs to happen at a bigger level and advocate for that. Sorry for cutting in.
No. So my last question for you is, how constructive or productive do you think legislation for corporations, like cap and trade schemes, for instance, or extended producer responsibility is? So for example, sometimes a cap is set too high and it doesn't have much effect due to political pressure, or companies choose, it's economically more viable for a company to choose to simply pay the fine than abide by a specific regulation. So how do you think that we can design better legislation? What role can it?
Sure. So, I mean, this is always a challenge for legislation, and it's like setting the tax rate. And at what point, what's the optimum point where you're collecting the most tax versus at what stage do too many people start trying to dodge it? And it's the same for any policy that you're designing. There have been some really effective policies, and I think the Perform, Achieve, Trade scheme has driven a lot of energy efficiency in some sectors, which has been really good. There's been some policies that have been less effective, and so I think the renewable purchase obligation is one, and also in a related sector, zero liquid discharge, which is motivated very rightly from the desire not to pollute groundwater or rivers, has resulted in industries burning energy, burning fossil fuels to boil water, meaning that India is more water scarce and global warming is increased. So kind of these counterintuitive results. So this is just to reinforce your point that there is an art to legislation, and we have people in government who are extremely well educated in order to be able to design policies accordingly. I think that what can help is transparent, collective engagement between all sorts of stakeholders with government. And so, it's important that business is one of the stakeholders at the table, but it operates in a transparent way, and that it doesn't seek to keep out civil society or other stakeholders depending on the sector. We were involved in a process, again, looking at electric mobility, where by working with some 50 companies in the electric vehicle value chain, so not just the builders or operators, but also on the consumer side, the fleet managers and the large employers who wanted their employees to be able to commute using electric vehicles. So the whole value chain. We engaged in a process with the ministries. The Ministry of Power was the nodal one, but there are other ministries involved around these FAME 2 legislation, really to look at which bits had been deployed, but more importantly, which bits of the policy had not been utilised, and engage constructively on what the ministry could do to ensure that those measures that weren't getting taken up were taken up. And we produced some consensus-based policy recommendations, which we put out in the public domain. So I think that collective, transparent engagement by stakeholders with policymakers is always important and is usually valued by government. And we've had other engagements where particular departments in other sectors, not electric mobility, have told us that they weren't interested. They heard our inputs and they understood them, but they weren't going to change, and they had good reasons for that. And we respect that as well. So but yeah, it needs to be a dynamic process to get policies right for more sustainable outcomes.
No, I agree completely. And I think in particular, it's so important to engage with stakeholders that have lower social capital, like the informal sector, for instance. They contribute such a large portion of the workforce, especially in developing countries, but their needs are often overlooked. So I think, it's really important to engage stakeholders across the socioeconomic spectrum. Yeah.
That's a great point, which probably we could do more of. So thank you for that.
Yeah, so I don't have any more questions, but thank you so much. I think I learned a lot today, and it was really great listening.
Me too. Yeah, me too. Avni, a pleasure to meet you and a pleasure to interact.
Yeah, thank you so much.